Hey listeners, we're nearing the end of our 15th anniversary fundraising campaign, and we need your help to meet our goal. This campaign offers you a chance to win a unique food and music experience in one of the most exciting cities in America. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and you'll be entered to win dinner for two and 2 tickets to a concert in one of 8 amazing cities: New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and Asheville. All donations support our work educating food system storytellers. And when you donate, you can choose one of those cities and you'll be entered to win dinner and 2 tickets to a show. So help us reach our goal and enter to win dinner and a show in the city of your choice. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We do more varieties and flavors of cheese than anywhere else on Earth. By pushing the boundaries of what cheese can and should be, find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
This is Gastronomica, a podcast on Heritage Radio Network. I'm your host for today, Alicia Galvez. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. We are members of the editorial collective of Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, published by the University of California Press. So it seems like we are well positioned to have some opinions on where food studies, a relatively young and interdisciplinary field of study, is today and where we can imagine it to be tomorrow. The idea for this conversation emerged from a series of conversations we've been having behind the scenes, both in our editorial collective meetings as well as every time we read a submission to the journal. The idea of what we need or what we want as food studies scholars and as journal editors is not fixed, much less unanimously shared among us. It emerges iteratively as we read submissions, as we read and write and teach in the field and talk to others who do. And we argue about it a lot. But that conversation is revealing for where we are and where we could be going. For this episode of the podcast, we thought we'd bring you, the listener, behind the scenes into our editorial process a bit. Hopefully, we will illuminate some of the ways we think about the work we receive, what our expectations and editorial wish lists are, but more importantly, we hope to issue an invitation to authors out there to consider placing your work in our care. First, we'll go around and introduce ourselves. Jessica, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Alicia. Nice to see all of you this morning. My name is Jessica Carbone. I'm the managing editor for Gastronomica. I am also in the processes of finishing my doctorate in American Studies at Harvard University.
Irina?
Yeah, thank you, Alicia, and good morning, everybody. I'm Irina Mihalake, and I'm joining from the University of Toronto, where I am a professor of museum studies at the Faculty of Information.
Krishnendu.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you. I'm speaking to you about a block south of Washington Square Park in New York City. I'm associated with the NYU Food Studies program, and I run the doctoral program in food studies.
Sina?
Hello, everyone. I'm Sina Rousseau, and I'm speaking to you from Cape Town, where I teach at the University of Cape Town. Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
And my name is Alicia Galvez. I'm professor of Latin American and Latino studies, as well as anthropology at Lehman College and the City University of New York. It's really nice to see you all. We're excited to have this conversation together. We've been talking about this conversation for a while, so it's nice to finally be here. And I thought we'd kick it off by just asking, is there a piece in Gastronomica in the last year or so that you love that's kind of your ideal of what Gastronomica can do as a journal? What can we learn from that piece for future pieces? Sina, do you have a favorite?
Well, I do. I did sign up to answer this question, but unfortunately, I'm going to be one of those irritating guests who kind of like bends the question from the beginning, because you asked about in the last year or so, and the two that immediately came to mind were actually from 2021. So I hope you'll allow that. It was from an issue that I co-edited with Daniel Bender, my co-chair on the editorial collective. And the two pieces are one from an author called John D'Amico Kingham, and the piece is called Uncontrolled Movements, an Overview of Abdicated Control in Florida's Prison Food Spaces. And this author had spent 37 years incarcerated and entrusted us with his autoethnography of a lived experience of power shifts played out in settings like the dining hall and kitchen in a penitentiary. And it was really kind of remarkable to see an exploration of what many listeners and many of our readers will know as Foucault's power structures kind of from the inside, and something that we don't always get to be privy to. And in that same issue, there was another very moving piece by an author called Joel Rodriguez, and the piece was called Classical Dishes, Taste and Violence, which was a beautifully and sensitively written piece about growing up in India, but it was also about domestic abuse and a personal account of growing up in a household where the consequences of his mother, in this case, not delivering a dish that was considered or judged to be classic enough, had very different and negative, or much more negative consequences than, for example, being kicked off MasterChef. And I thought both of these pieces were very brave and surprising and insightful, and it was a real privilege to kind of shepherd them onto our pages.
Jess, do you have a favorite? You, as our managing editor, read everything, so you probably have a lot of favorites and just a lot of information that you have stored in your brain.
It is one of the great joys of working on a journal like Gastronomica, where you get to read such a wonderful breadth of submissions on both the topics and the styles in which they're written. And of course, I have one favorite from our sort of traditionally conceptualized scholarly cluster, and one from our more creative cluster, which we call Food Phenomena. But I think they're actually both exemplary pieces of scholarship and of insightful creative approaches to talking about food. So they're both from the last year. Sorry, I did follow the assignment, Sina, because I'm still a graduate student. So my favorite Food Phenomena piece was from Rick Halpern, who's at the University of Toronto. And it's a wonderful photo essay of images from the photographer Bernice Abbott of her Depression-era foodscapes in New York City. As someone who is somewhat hidebound by her doctoral program, I don't get to go to every archive I want to go to. And there's something so wonderful about someone offering this primary source framed with really wonderful analysis as a visual essay, because it makes me feel like I'm right there looking at the images with him, benefiting from Halpern's insights and analysis lifetime in the archive. So I just adored that piece, and I've shared it with so many people. The other piece that I love is Alex Ketchum's piece from 23.1 on kitchen futurism. And she specifically looks at the role that robots and, to a certain degree, artificial intelligence play in the cultural imaginary of what we think our kitchens should be. I love a piece that straddles the boundary between different disciplines, as so much of food study scholarship does. And this is really a wonderful blend of sociological and theoretical analysis, historical analysis, pop culture analysis, and it isn't afraid to ask questions about what's still to come in the world of food culture and society. I think it's a marvelous exploration of something when all the questions that the article asks are not yet answered. And I really hope to see more articles like that.
That's a great set of criteria that you just gave us for what constitutes an excellent piece. And I was thinking as Sina was talking and you were talking, Jess, that one of the trademarks of Gastronomica for me is the quality of the writing. I just love good writing on almost any topic. And if it's on food, it's even better. But one of the things that I was overlooking in my obsession with the quality of our writing in our journal is the quality of the imagery. And that Bernice Abbott, the photographs in Rick Halpern's photo essay are just so stunning and so amazing to see as an artifact of past foodscapes.
If I can add one thing to that, I think we're so lucky as a journal to have the resources to still publish a highly visually illustrated journal, which is not something that every journal has the opportunity to do. And in food studies in particular, it's so essential sometimes that you include the imagery that accompanies the work, because it just really does bring the topic to life.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that is also interesting is just to see how food studies is ever shifting. Jess, you mentioned that we're interdisciplinary. And I think one of the things that's fun as far as the perspective of sitting on an editorial collective is just seeing the discipline kind of shift under our feet continuously. I was curious if any of you think of any recent or new development in food studies that you'd like to see more of, something that you're starting to see hints of on the horizon and are hoping to see some submissions that address maybe something that's under-researched or methodological innovation. Irina, do you have anything like that?
I do, and this was not an easy question to answer because I think the answer could go in so many different directions. But I'm gonna provide maybe two ideas, and hopefully they will generate some new exciting submissions. So I would actually love to see more co-written and collaborative work resulting from community-based research projects that actually focus on the process rather than on the outcome, or maybe the process and the outcome, because I think a focus on the process of the collaboration can highlight the non-linearity of community-engaged research, the beautiful messiness of relationship building, of trust building, and also the trial and error of co-created and co-owned research. So this is a little bit of an abstract desires that I have, but I think it would be really, I think a lot of us as you said, in the growing field of food studies, a lot of us are working with a lot of community organizations and food advocates, and it would be wonderful to see those voices coming together. And I think Gastronomica might be the right place for those types of collaborations. And secondly, and this comes a little bit from a personal place for me, I would love to see more Eastern and Central European food stories and voices in the North American food study landscape. And I would love those stories to be told by those who lived experiences of pre-communism, communism, and of the post-1989 transition to what was labeled at the time as a transition to democracy. I would also love to hear from researchers who are looking at Central and Eastern Europe food cultures through frameworks that go beyond communism. That is definitely not the only historical, moment in the lives of some very well-established European countries, but that tends to be the focus point for many who think about that part of the world. And I would love to see deeply historically driven stories of our very diverse foodways and foodscapes. So that's what I want to bring to the table today.
Thanks, Irina. I think that's so powerful what you said about process. I think often we think of journal publications as kind of a final step, an end point of projects instead of a processual, the possibility that they can be a waypoint, not an end point, and kind of point to process as opposed to final product. And I think that's a very liberating way to think about what we're doing in a publication, but also as scholars, if we can really think and write as we go. How about you, Jessica? Do you have any recent development in food studies that you're excited about?
Well, I so appreciate Irina highlighting the value of documenting process. So many articles that speak to people in Gastronomica can be eventually assigned on course syllabi. And when we think about what we might put on a syllabus, it's so important to think about what is a student going to learn how to do when they're reading an article, not just what are they learning about subject matter wise. So documenting visits to an archive, documenting what it looks like to assemble field notes that then immediately proceed to analysis, documenting encounters with material objects. Prior to graduate school, I came from the museum world, and I think it's so amazing when museum curators or collection specialists share something that has newly arrived, and they offer suggestions as to how it offers a new opportunity for interpretation. That's the kind of piece that not only lives as a model of good food scholarship, but it also teaches others what food scholarship can be in the doing of it. I think in terms of a methodological innovation that I love seeing, it's when people blend different kinds of source materials in their analysis. I also came from the world of popular food writing, and I, for one, love it when people show how you can cite or utilize popular food culture in a way that is critically informed and valuable to the world of food scholarship. So more cross-pollination overall is what I love.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah. And like Irina said, this is really about process. And I think really documenting different approaches, different methodologies, different snapshots from the field and archives. And I think that's one of the things that makes the combination of our scholarly articles and our food phenomena pieces so lively and dynamic. And then bringing in the additional angle of the podcast as well gives us a lot of different ways to approach the topics that we're thinking about. But of course, we're not operating in isolation. None of us, Krishnendu, you have a food studies appointment, but for most of us, we're doing food studies in conversation with other disciplines, and you are too, within food studies as well. There's no non-interdisciplinary food studies space. And so thinking about the broader academic world, but really I would like to ask you about the broader world. What is happening in the world, and how is food studies obliged to respond? How do we move forward in this interdisciplinary space in ways that we think respond to the urgency of what's going on today in the places and communities that we're in communication with and living in?
Yeah, no, this discussion has been so productive that it's sending me off in multiple directions. So I'm going to go back to one of your earlier questions and then kind of talk about the specific question. I really find the visual material in Gastronomica so compelling. The cover, in some ways, it reminds me of a lot of the theoretical literature. In fact, Marshall McLuhan had said long ago that it's with audio visuality that in some ways food will become a lot more visible, a lot more looked at, and of course, in this case, also listened to. And so for me, that has been one of the most compelling ways of thinking about what to make of Gastronomica, its strengths, and it's of course a domain in which I'm not an expert. So there are other people. That's what I really, really love about Gastronomica, that I work with about a dozen other people who are experts in other domain. In the process, I am learning how to look at visual material, how to analyze visual material. So for me, Gastronomica has become not only an important tool to teach and think through, but teach myself. It's the most interesting collaborative enterprise that I've ever been a part of. Within that frame, then, a couple of things. I work mostly, Alicia, I work mostly in the domain of migration and food practices, what changes, what doesn't, how do people care about their food practices, how do they care about, etc. And one of the things we know that in terms of international migration, about 3.6% of the world's population is moving internationally. And by the way, that number in terms of percentage has not changed that much from 100 years ago, 1900, was 3% of the global population. So there's part of a panic in the global north. Of course, the numbers are larger. 3.6% of 8 billion is different from 3% of a billion to billion. But even more interestingly, we know a lot less about the food practices of migrants moving within the country. They're transregional. We know a lot more, in fact, ironically, about migrants moving across national borders because they become a target of policy. So they become objects of analysis. We know a lot less about, say, India, where millions of people, multiple times of 3%, are moving within the country, in China, in Brazil, in Mexico. And what is that doing to regional cuisines, like in India, for instance? To just give you one example, its last census, I think, identified 22,000 dialects. So my sense is wherever there's a dialect, there's a cuisine, both in terms of its relationship to landscape, relationship to agricultural land, but also, of course, how we make food intersubjective, which is by talking about it, words. So if the language changes, in a sense, the cuisine changes. So a lot more of this work about intranational migration is one of the things. Maybe I've gone on too long. I'll stop here and let someone else jump in.
I'm so glad Krishnendu brought this question up about the multiple discourses and languages, because we have a longstanding CFP that is open-ended. You could submit at any time, that relates to translating the foods of the world. And that's both a piece that meditates on the work of translation and offers translations of pieces that may not have ever been transcribed into English before. That is something that you can find up on the Gastronomica website. We'll put it in the show notes as well.
Thanks, all. And I wanted to say I made some notes for a question that is probably going to come later. But Krishnendu, you are speaking now about migration, and the question was about what's going on in the world. Jess, you were also talking about the importance of reflections on popular culture. And I'm sure many of us and our readers are distressed by watching the things that happen on our screens. And the other day, like probably also many people, I watched the first Dune film in preparation for the second one, which has just hit the screens. And I found it impossible to watch without thinking about food and spice routes and what is happening in the Middle Eastern region. And to Krishnendu's point, specifically when I was thinking about some of the questions that Alicia had posed to us, I was looking at BBC reports on children dying of starvation in Gaza. And because borders had been closed to aid being delivered and so on, a very complicated situation which led to airdrops of food aid, which resulted in some people dying because their parachutes didn't work, and these food aid parcels crashed on at least 5 people and killed them. And in thinking, I have so many questions and thinking about how to process things like this, there are also all the untold stories, which I'm sure someone is able to help us to understand, like, where does that flour come from? Who makes the parachutes? Who makes the sacks? How can we understand a situation in which children are scraping up handfuls of flour from the ground in a refugee camp that has existed for 70 years? So this is news, this is the backstory of news. It's also food studies. And these are important things that I think we can hopefully be a space to also explore.
Thank you, Sina. I think these are such important points. And thank you, Krishnendu. I think also coming from a background where I've worked on migration and immigrant struggles for justice, for citizenship rights for a couple of decades, I think my wish list for food studies is that we never forget the relationship between justice, food justice, human rights. I think these are inseparable issues. And I think sometimes food studies tends towards the apolitical as a larger field. And I personally feel like I always want to pull the cord back in the other direction, because I think there is no such thing as an apolitical way of thinking about food. We're in a time of extreme climate crisis, wars, resurgences of white supremacism and authoritarianism. And food is one of those issues that's just embedded with everything else. There is no separating it out from everything else. And so for me, I like it when pieces really connect dots in ways that, we may not realize are connected, and take those really elemental concerns around well-being and what we consume, what we ingest, the feeling of safety that comes from nourishment and the feeling of unsafety that comes from lack of access to nourishment, the primacy of those sorts of sensations and those experiences, for me, is what I want to see more of in food studies today. Is there anything that we can see being overdone? Are we tired of anything? Is there anything that we maybe could take a pause on? Any sort of pet peeves that we might have? This is overall a conversation where we're really focusing on what we love and our wish lists, but we can take a brief moment to be snarky and say, if there's anything that we don't need more of at the moment. Sina, do you have anything like that?
I do, as it happens. I was thinking about this quite carefully, and one of the first things that came to mind was the kind of overuse of theory. And I actually wrote in my notes, I wrote Bourdieu, but I wrote Bourdieu. But that's not because I have any problem with Bourdieu. Actually, it's not about theory being irrelevant. It's rather, I think, the kind of assumption of a continued importance or relevance of something. And Jess, you spoke earlier about a kind of critical engagement with sources that are cited, and that is so key, I think, rather than assuming that people know who you're talking about or what the theory represents and so on. And we've been very lucky to see some of that happening already. Just in one of the recent podcast episodes with an author from 23.4, from our special section on sweetness in Japan, there was an excellent conversation where there was an acknowledgement of one of food studies scholars will recognize Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power as a canonical text in a very young discipline. But it was such an excellent demonstration of engaging with that source, not with assumptions of everyone knowing what it was about or how it was relevant, but also diverging with it, acknowledging and teaching readers in the process. And I think that is really key. So I think getting rid of that assumption of, and I think for some people, and especially older and more established scholars, it kind of maybe goes without saying. We can drop names in conversation and assume that the people we're talking to know what we're talking about. But I still want my mother to be able to learn something from Gastronomica. And if there's just a citation to Bourdieu without explaining who he was, why we care, then it doesn't really add value. And the second thing is that we do talk a lot about the so-called global South and the global North, encouraging representation, as we've already touched on, from the South, where I'm based, in an attempt to give space to voices, emerging scholars, and so on, who may not easily find a home in other publications or so on. But it still amazes me how many submissions we get, even the very good ones, that continue to display sort of blind spots around assumed readers and what they know and where they are. So small things like defaulting to fall to describe what many people around the world call autumn, and which also falls at a very different time of the year. And I hope that I can speak for the editorial collective to say that we aim for more hospitality in our writing and our submissions and our readerships, and to not exclude people. Yeah, go for it, Krishnendu.
Yes, no, I want to riff off that you raised kind of at least two beautiful points. And I was trying to think, how do you organize my thinking about it? One, we want more of everything, because that makes the field richer, that makes the journal better, that in some ways teaches me about domains of knowledge I'm not very familiar with. But one of the things Sinia said about Bourdieu as an illustration is in fact a good illustration. And I've seen a bit of a tendency to do a lot of cultural politics without any political economy. And since Bourdieu is dead, we can pin the blame on him a little bit, where one of the critiques of Bourdieu has always been that where is capitalism in the discussion about cultural capital? And so I think Bourdieu's work is absolutely phenomenal and powerful, and I use it as a canonical text to understand hierarchy and domination. And Bourdieu's question, of course, is how does cultural domination still work in spite of democracy? Okay, and so in some ways, these other idioms about it. So to illustrate examples, so it would be good to have, say, a discussion on cultural politics of gentrification. I see a lot of pieces submitted. But pieces on gentrification just use it as a mantra rather than pointing to, for instance, wages, rents, livelihoods, and prices. How do you write about gentrification without pointing out wages, profits, rents, and livelihoods? So in some ways, this separation between the political, economic, and cultural politics, in some instances, I think it has been taken to absurd limits post Bourdieu. Okay, and I think we need a little bit of a convergence. It's great to talk about cultural politics. Cultural politics is important, but give me some sense of wages, prices, livelihoods, rents when you're talking about gentrification. Otherwise, it became a bit like gentrification has become a bit like neoliberalism. So everything is put in that pot and nothing is explained. And this leads to the second point that Sinia made, which is, and I find it both a challenge and one of the real pleasures of doing food studies, which is how do you produce, let me call it esoteric knowledge for an exoteric audience, and insider knowledge for an outsider audience. Okay, for me, it's not like a problem I have solved. My father said when I published The Ethnic Restaurateur, he said, "Wow, this is fantastic. It must be a fantastic book because I did not understand anything you said." And that's for me was kind of both a compliment and what felt like a backhanded one, because he's coming from an idea that if it is good, my father should not be able to understand because it's such a specialized knowledge, okay? Which goes against the weight of the ambition of food studies, the reason for the genesis of food studies, and the reason for a journal like Gastronomica is that can we take specialized knowledge? Specialization is important. Specialization is relevant. Can we take specialized knowledge and articulate it in a manner in which it is accessible across disciplines, across audiences? So I think I have failed until I can convince people like my father, say, read my piece and you should be able to understand most of it. So Sinia's point about explaining who these people are, who these theorists are, including canonical figures like Sidney Mintz, and doing it, and the Sidney Mintz example is a lovely example. For instance, I think We know a lot about sweetness and power in the Atlantic. We know very little about sweetness and power, for instance, in the Indian Ocean world, where cane sugar and crystallized sugar emerges out of the Gangetic Plain in India. And we do not have one text that says, so what is the context of sweetness and power in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean world? So, I mean, both your points, Sinia, is absolutely a perfect illustration of the challenges and the opportunities in a journal like Gastronomica. Maybe one last point, Alicia, if I'm not taking too much time, is I find the most useful, this is referencing your opening comments, I find the most useful processes are the processes of reconciliation that happens within a group of a dozen scholars trying to agree upon what is a good standard of communication and what is a good standard of scholarship. For me, that is the most education I've gotten since grad school. And that happens in Gastronomica.
Thank you so much. I think what you're saying there are so many takeaways for me from what you just said, Krishnendu. One of them I will remember and may use, if giving you credit, which is the idea of cultural politics being useless without political economy, that we really need to get back into the nuts and bolts. And as we get back into the nuts and bolts, we make ourselves more accessible. And I think what you're saying there is really speaking to what I sometimes think about as a scholar who teaches in a public university that serves New York City, that is an engine of social mobility. I really think about how can we reveal and unpack what we sometimes refer to as the second syllabus, right? The sort of mysterious code language that a lot of scholars and academics use that maybe sometimes sounds smart, quote unquote, but really doesn't do anything to communicate, to make our work translational, or to make our work agentive in terms of what kinds of policies, what kinds of worlds we would like to see come from our research, from our findings. And so I think we'll come back to that in a few minutes. We're going to take a break now, and we'll come back in a few minutes and really talk about how do we operate as a journal, that reconciliation process that you just ended with, Krishnendu, how we really think about when we receive a work, how we read it, and what we would like authors to expect from us, what we would like to promise, our editorial promise to those who submit to us. So we'll be back in just a moment. Thanks. Stick with us.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheesemaking excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheesemaking traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheesemaking culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheesemaking craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
And we're back. This is Gastronomica on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Alicia Galvez, talking with Sina Russo, Irina Mielache, Jessica Carbone, and Krishnendu Ray. As we're talking today, I was wondering if we could send a message to prospective Gastronomica authors about what they can expect if they submit their work to us. It seems like a lot of what we're talking about could be relevant to prospective authors. What can authors expect? Jess, you are the first to interface, and often the main interface that our authors see and talk to when they submit something. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I am the first person that sees when a new piece is submitted, and I channel it into one of two clusters, as we call it. So there's the scholarly cluster and the food phenomena cluster, and each has its own review process. So all pieces are submitted as blinded submissions. And to find all the guidelines for how to submit to Gastronomica, you can do so in our website, which we'll put in the show notes. But what we do for a scholarly piece is first send it to what we call a deskie. And that's someone within the scholarly group of editors who will give it an initial read to determine if it is in adequate shape and of interest to the journal. And by interest, I mean that it's a relevant subject for the journal to potentially review before suggesting peer reviewers. So if a desk editor says, this is not really about food, this is not really appropriate for the journal, or belongs in a more specialized journal, you'll receive a rejection right away suggesting that it go elsewhere. If it is determined appropriate for peer review, we will then direct it to 2 anonymized peer reviewers who will have about a month to read the submission and to offer feedback based on our guidelines for reviewing. So we ask some questions about if the piece offers new and insightful contributions to food studies, if the prose is sufficiently enlightening, if it engages with secondary literature where appropriate, and any other notes that we might want to offer as reviewers to the author on how to strengthen the manuscript. So reviewers have about a month to compile that assessment, and they return it to us. If reviewers are in agreement, say they both suggest revise and resubmits, we compile that information, we anonymize the reviewers, and then we return the reviews to the authors with that feedback so that authors have every bit of information that they can have to inform their review process. If reviewers come back with 2 different verdicts, say one says this should receive a conditional accept for publication, perhaps pending some minor revisions, and the other says, no, the revisions are more substantial, it should be a revise and resubmit, then what we'll do is send the 2 reviews to our scholarly cluster for discussion. And there will be a reconciliation based on the editors looking at those 2 reviews and offering a coherent distillation of the feedback. And again, the goal is always to give authors enough information so that they feel really informed about what is expected of them and what is feasible for them to return a manuscript in publishable condition. We try to do this as quickly as possible because we really don't want authors to be sitting in a to-read pile for months and months and months on end. We know how important it is, especially for people who are going up for tenure review, to get their pieces from the point of submission to the point of publication as swiftly as possible. And we do everything we can on our end to make sure that that's possible. And then we go to the food phenomena cluster. So food phenomena, these are creative pieces, these are visually enriched pieces, these are pieces that often have just as much insight as scholarly pieces, but are presented in a different format, in a format that deviates from the conventional scholarly presentation of a piece. Again, the food phenomena piece, a good food phenomena piece is its own distinct genre. It is not a bad or underbaked scholarly piece. It is a very well thought, informed, creative submission. So when we receive food phenomena pieces, we direct them to the entire cluster of food phenomena editors, and they read them en masse once a month when we have our monthly meeting to say, do we like this? Does this require any revisions? Are the revisions going to honor what the author wants the piece to be rather than our separate version or vision of what that story should be? And then we send that feedback to the authors. So as I've presented here, we try to do as fast and as thorough a turnaround as possible. And we really want authors to feel empowered by the feedback that we offer. If you get feedback that you don't agree with, we understand that people may not want to resubmit. And that's entirely fine. We just like to know that they're not planning to resubmit. But on the whole, we've gotten a lot of feedback from people who have contributed to the journal, whether or not their piece was accepted, that the feedback that they ultimately receive is very helpful and delivered in a very timely fashion. So in terms of what we're looking for as people plan to contribute, I'll pop over to Irina, who's on our food phenomena cluster.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jessica, for that overview. It's, as we talked earlier, it's always good to be transparent about our process and to remind everybody that we have a very collegial and dialogic process at play. So you've heard a lot from my colleagues about some hopes and dreams and maybe not-tos in Gastronomica submissions. What I did in the last few weeks is that I polled my colleagues in the food phenomena group about what are some hopes and dreams that we specifically have about submissions. And I would like to share with you some of these options. This is not a limited, it's not even a list, it's more of a bucket of things that we hope to receive, but you can add your thoughts to the bucket as well and introduce us to certain things that we haven't imagined together. So we would love to see object stories align with what Jessica, but also Krishnendu mentioned earlier. There are amazing collections of material cultures that live their second or third life in archives and museums. And we would love to invite our GLAM colleagues to contribute to Gastronomica, but also think about the current moment in this institution. So for example, in archival studies, we are in a beautiful moment of reparative description. In many museums are working closely with global communities, indigenous communities, to repatriate and rematriate belongings and relatives. We are at a moment when we have these beautiful connections with diasporic communities to enrich the existing stories of objects. So we would love to hear the stories about food-related objects that exist in your institutions. We would love to highlight reflections on pedagogy, so food studies, pedagogical experimentations, right? Many of us here are teachers and mentors in various capacities, in academia, outside of academia, and we would love to open up conversations about teaching and pedagogy and learning. We love food-centered autobiographical essays. We do receive quite a lot, and we would love to see more pieces that go outside of the framework of nostalgia. We would love a more diversity of engagements with lived experiences and autobiographical work. Please send us any type of methodological innovations that could be inspiring, as Jessica mentioned earlier, to students and professors. We would also welcome controversial and daring discussions that think very critically about food issues, original images, artwork, and photo essays. We are really appreciative of when we receive these pieces, but we do want a strong and cohesive narrative, a question, a critical inquiry, what brings, some beautiful images together. For non-creative fiction, we would love minimum jargon, a new and unique perspective on a phenomena, a show, don't tell approach. We would also love to see more meditations on ingredients, recipes, especially when the writer is in the process of learning how to make those recipes and how to use specific ingredients. And we would be interested in conversations around the virtual food community landscapes that exists. And lastly, I would like to bring up a previous issue on water that was edited by our wonderful colleague Paula Johnson, for kind of an invitation to think about thematic sections of Gastronomica that merge academic and food phenomena pieces. So these are some ideas that we would like to throw at you, and please throw them back at us with some wonderful submissions and new ideas for how you can become part of the Gastronomica.
Thank you so much, Irina. That's such a rich wish list, and you have, I know, I'm really, my mouth is watering just thinking about what kinds of things I can encourage friends and colleagues to write in response to that very rich call for submissions. I can share my own perspective. I have written for other journals and have been a peer reviewer for other journals, but it was really when I submitted to Gastronomica as an author that I was able to see how this journal is different from others. My own personal experience with my piece on paqueteros, who are the informal package couriers who bring goods back and forth from rural Mexico to New York City. There was so much care given to my piece. It was just a very supportive and affirming process from start to finish. And I felt like my work was cared for so much in a way that really, for me, made it not feel like there's something usually so stressful and sometimes even traumatizing about the peer review process. And it was so non-traumatizing that it made me almost feel like, how did this even happen? How is this a scholarly journal? And so to have the scholarly caliber that the journal has along with the care, I think is really unique. And I think as a recently arrived, just finished my year or so anniversary as a member of the editorial collective, I can see that when we receive a piece, there's care given to the piece and given to the author from start to finish. In my experience, I've never seen a piece rejected because of any consideration other than fit. If it's not a piece about food studies, if it's not a good fit for the journal, then it's redirected. But virtually every other piece that comes across our desks, we're engaging in a conversation with the authors about where we could see it going. And so I think that's such an amazing experience for anyone, for established scholars and for emergent scholars, because if you are nervous about submitting to a journal, or it's your first time submitting to a journal and you're afraid that the work might not be ready or that it might not be framed fully, that's okay. I think, the dialogue that emerges with the peer reviewers, with the entire editorial collective is just so positive and collaborative and cooperative. And so I think that's a really nice hidden aspect, perhaps, of the Gastronomica experience. Speaking of, as we wind up today, I was wondering if we could think about what else we would like to see in the future. What would we like to see for our journal? What would we like to see for food studies in general? And call it a gimmick, but can we use an adjective, a food-related adjective, or an eating-related adjective to think about what we would like to see in the future? Krishnendu, do you have any ideas of what you'd like to see?
Let me be a literalist. Chewy, masticates. So in some ways, as literally, like things like kat and pan, gum, things we chew but do not swallow. Okay, and in some ways, which is a way of thinking about food in a slightly expansive way, and I can also invert it in a sense. Instances of drinking coffee with salt. There are whole groups, whole civilizations that do that. Drinking tea with butter. So that in some ways, things we do not associate and often looks from dominant practitioners looks weird and marginal. But in fact, we're at the source, like Ethiopians drinking coffee with salt long before sugar, and so those kinds of instances of things that make us denaturalize dominant modes of consumption. Okay, and dominant modes of production and distribution. And some of this, again, I think that's powerful about food studies. That's powerful about Gastronomica. I learned to pay attention to it from my students' attention to things, from my colleagues' attention to things. So in that sense, where learning and thinking always happens in a collaborative network of agreement and disagreement. And I think for me, as I've referenced before, was a crucial part of what makes Gastronomica so interesting is, can a dozen scholars who generally work as crafts workers on their own develop a collaborative standard of good research, good communication, and a piece that fits Gastronomica. So this kind of other ways, and my last point in this is a pan which comes out of Southeast Asia, spreads to India, for instance. In India, for instance, there are millions of pan shops. And I have read so much about coffee houses and the public in Habermas, in the nationalism literature, okay? I have not read one piece on pawn shops, which are also in the public, okay? Pawn is P-A-A-N, or so not a pawn shop, not a P-A-W-N, but PAAN. And what's interesting about
And not a pawn shop.
not a porn shop
Not a
also,
porn
yes.
shop.
And so
Right.
it's a masticate that comes out of mobile populations, out of Southeast Asia, and flows against the gradient of power. Gradient of power in the Indian Ocean world. In this case, it is not like Brahminism, it's not like Brahmins, it is not like temple architecture of Angkor Wat that is very influenced by Brahminical notions of hierarchy and what is good taste and etc. So it flows against the gradient of power from mobile people from Southeast Asia to South Asia, and from peninsular South Asia to northern India, which is the dominant hegemonic mode. And because of that, and because, coming back to masticates, because mastication in this particular format, especially with expectoration, has been developed in the modern world as something disgusting. So things that have gone out of fashion are, in fact, probably the most interesting things to study because it historicizes our contemporary fashion. Think about smoking. Think about drinking Coca-Cola. That from 50 years from now, and with smoking already, we will know how bad it was for us. But in some ways, then we historicize it instead of thinking of a cold, sweet drink as a naturally attractive to our aesthetics of practice. So in some ways, chewy stuff like that puts me in a different place, in a different order of practice, that I think would be absolutely a lot of fun to reinvigorate analysis in those domains of outdated mastics.
I love that, outdated mastics. I think you might need to start us off and do a special issue on that, a roundtable on mastics. That's great. Thank you. Jessica, do you have one?
Yes, I love the notion of an entire issue dedicated to things that we chew but don't swallow, because there are so many different global phenomenons that could factor into that without ever once touching the theoretical framework of disgust, which I actually think we've covered quite well in the journal. But it's a lovely provocation. I took inspiration when you posed this question, Alicia, from something that I once asked the person who taught me to edit cookbooks. The late, great editor, Judith Jones. I started my career as a cookbook editor. I asked her once what she was looking for in a great cookbook. And she gave me this anecdote about asking Julia Child what kind of food she loved best. And Julia said, "I love food that is soigné." And the person who had asked her that question said, "Well, what's soigné?" And Julia crossed her legs and uncrossed them and said, "That's soigné." And the way Judith explained that to me is that there's something that is partially about confidence and partially about elegance that defines great food, and I would argue now great food scholarship. I'm so much more compelled to read something, even something I don't agree with, when it is confident, when it is not afraid to have a perspective and a really clear tone in its prose, and it's doing something that's a little bit more bold than the safe argument. I think there's lots of room, even as we talk about expanding our subject area coverage and our global network of contributors, to finding different ways to express confidence and boldness in tone, especially in our creative food phenomena pieces. So I would hope that whatever someone is writing about, they think about what they're writing about as if they're designing the perfect little black dress. Just because it's a little black dress doesn't mean it doesn't have style, it doesn't have perspective, doesn't mean it doesn't have a point of view. And that's what I always hope. Whatever you're writing about, no matter the topic, you are approaching it as though you are creating the little black dress soigné version of that piece. And you go forth with confidence and boldness and a bit of soigné.
Thank you so much. Well, this has been a chewy conversation, a juicy conversation. moments of saltiness in there, a lot of sweetness. And I think it's just such a pleasure to be a part of this community, and really an invitation to everyone out there who might be listening to think about becoming part of our community by submitting. We really just welcome all of your thoughts and ideas and contributions. As you can see, our vision of food studies is quite capacious, quite expansive. Please join us again next week when we'll be talking with author Pooja Kalita about her article on gender roles and the production of pitas in Assam. It'll be available in our newest issue, 24.1, which is now online. For more details, you can visit gastronomica.org and subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes this season. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to reading and chewing over these ideas with you in the future. Thank you.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.